On occasion, I need to photograph something on a white background. Typically when I do that, I want there to be a slight reflection under it so that I get the product or whatever I'm shooting, a good reflection of it, but a blown out white background so I can use it on a website or in print products. There are a couple different ways to achieve this. My preferred method is for the background, a softbox, and for the reflection, plexiglass. So let's take a look at the setup. So the first thing that I do, lay out my horses, put up my plexiglass, pick a spot for my product. I need to know exactly where that product is going to sit and any additional products that I'm going to rotate out because I'm going to meter my light for exactly that location. This is important because I want to know that my product is properly exposed but that I have a blown out white background and I need to position everything appropriately for that. The first thing I'm going to do, turn on my light meter, turn on my trigger for my flash units, which I have in my hand. So I've got my light meter, my trigger, my little creature or product, whatever I happen to be taking a photo of, and my key light. That's where I'm going to start. I'm going to meter these two lights independently of one another so that I know exactly what this one is doing and exactly what this one is doing. Now this one I have pretty close. I have it gridded, I have it close. I want that light to get in on this product, but I don't want it to spread really wide. I want to, as tightly as I can, get around the product. So I've got a box here of about 24 inches, but I don't want it so big or spreading so much that it washes out my reflection in the plexiglass. Hence, I'm using this grid. I've set my camera to ISO 100 and 1/200th of a second. I want a nice low ISO for no noise, and I want my shutter speed to be whatever the maximum is that's going to match my sync speed for my flash units. I've also set my camera to f11. That gives me a little bit of depth of field in case my product has some depth to it. So I'm not shooting at 2.8 or 4.0. I'm shooting with a little bit of depth. And I need to meter this light to that. So I've set my light meter to ISO 100 to match the camera, shutter speed 1/200th of a second. And now I'm going to adjust this light to be f11 at the product so that the product has the same exposure as my camera. So I'm going to tell my light meter to watch for the flash, and then I'm going to tell just my key light to flash as I hold the meter over the product. And for the first light, I'm going to hold the meter right here over the product and point it straight at the key light. I'm getting about 13. It's pretty close, but I'm going to make a small adjustment. So now I'm metering at f11 right here. I know that this is going to be properly exposed. Now the next thing I want to do is meter this backlight for one stop brighter, which is f16. Remember, we go from 2 to 2.8 to 4 and on up. And that is, as we go up, the aperture is getting smaller. As we go down in numbers from 4 to 2.8 to 2, the aperture is getting larger because it's a ratio. So if this is f11 and I want this to be brighter, so I want it to be expecting a smaller aperture, so it's going to put out more light, assuming the aperture is smaller. That means I want it to be metered at 16, which is a higher number but a smaller hole. I know, that's a little confusing in the beginning, but f16 is one stop brighter than f11. I'm going to meter right at the light, and when I fire it, I'm getting f11. I need a little bit more light, so I'm going to go up one full stop, f16. So now I have f11 here, f16 here. Now you'll notice I've got a fair bit of distance between this and this. The reason being, this is metered at f11. That's what this needs to be. This is metered at f16. f16 back here. As we get further away, the light is falling off very rapidly. So what's not happening, because I don't want it to happen, is this light is not really impacting the exposure here. By the time the light gets here, there's not enough intensity to impact this, because I don't want to overexpose this. I don't want a blast of white light hitting this and wrapping around it. So I've created some distance here, but I've kept this one close so that this one is impacting this. This one is, for all intents and purposes, not impacting this. I've also set this softbox so that it's just below the edge of the plexiglass, so that I have solid white, it's going to blow out this area, and I'm not going to see a line. That takes some playing with. I did a couple of test shots, and I checked and made sure I didn't have a black line from the bottom edge of the softbox. What I don't want to do is push the softbox too low, because then it will shine up under the plexiglass, and it will actually cause some washout in the reflection. You actually have to be careful of that over here a little bit too. I'm not going to worry about that too much because it's a reflection. So as long as the reflection is there, even if I see a little bit of this contouring in it, that's not really going to be noticed. But I could play with that. I could take the grid out and eliminate that. But what I don't want is, if this is too low, the light going under will literally make a white strip under here. So you'll lose that part of the reflection. So there's distance, so that the light is falling off as you get here. The inverse square law is the technical name for that. We can go into that on another video, but basically the further away something is, if you meter at the thing, the light falls off from there. If you meter at the subject, the fall off begins there. We don't want that. We want the fall off to happen from here in. The other thing you'll notice that I've set up is a reflector. There's light coming from here that's impacting the subject. There's light coming from here that's not impacting the subject, but creating a white background. But there's no light coming from over here. There's a lot of dragon over here in this particular product. This will capture some of this light coming out of the key light and bounce it back into this little dragon and help fill in the shadows a little bit. I prefer that to another light on that side, because with things like this and with a lot of products, you'll have to make fine-tuning adjustments to get those shadows just the way that you want them. And a reflector is much easier to deal with for the fill of the shadows than another light. Some larger things you're going to have to. For something small like this, a reflector is going to serve quite well. So I've got my key light, I've got my backlight, I've got my reflector. We're going to go to the camera. We've got one more thing to do before we take our first test shot. So in this room, I obviously have video lights on so that you can see me and so that you can see the setup that I'm working with. The first thing I need to do is make sure that none of that light in this room is going to affect my exposure. So as we've said, I have my camera set at 1/200th of a second, ISO 100, f11. I'm not going to put my trigger on. I'm not going to fire my strobe units. What I'm going to do is, not even going to bother focusing, I'm going to fire off a shot. What I'm hoping for is exactly this that you're seeing right now, a black image. That means none of the ambient light in this room is impacting my exposure. So I know the only light that I have to deal with is the light from the key light, the light from the backlight, and anything bouncing back in from the reflector. Nothing else in the room is going to impact my exposure because I took that test shot at my settings. So now, on with the trigger. Now that I've got my trigger on, the next time I fire, those strobes are going to flash. So we're going to take a test shot. I'm going to focus on the face of my dragon, make sure that I'm framed, that the dragon and his reflection are both in the shot, and that I have the white box, I have the plexiglass. There could be other things ancillary off to the sides that I can get rid of in post. If a reflector happens to stick in a little bit or something like that, I can deal with that in post. I want to make sure I have enough room around him that none of those ancillary things are intersecting him. As long as they're a little bit away from him, that's fine. So, first shot. Now I have my camera set to show me the red flashing blown out highlights. I find that valuable. I think particularly for this kind of shooting, I want to know two things. A, the area around the creature is blown out. I also want to know that nowhere in the creature is blown out. So I want to know what is and what isn't. I'm going to zoom in a little bit, poke around a little bit, make sure everything looks good, everything's in focus. When I do this, not everything necessarily all the way to the edges is going to show fully blown out. And that's okay, because when I deal with the raw file in Lightroom or Capture One or whatever you're going to use, you can bring that up a little bit. So as long as around the creature, nothing that's touching the creature, the product, is not, but as long as everything around the creature, around the product, is fully blown out, you're fine. It should be blown out for a ways out, but if you've got some that's not, that's fine. You're going to end up getting rid of that anyway, and you're just going to go to straight white. So don't worry about literally the entire frame being blown out, but make sure you have around the product blown out. Once you're comfortable with that and everything looks good, you're ready to start looking at the composition of the shot. Now, one thing I want to check here is, do I have good depth of field? Do I have good fill in the shadows? Everything here seems to have gone pretty well, except one thing. Now, this is unique among small products like this. Depending on how you rotate them, right now, the back wing of this dragon effectively looks like it's in his mouth. And this is a good point also when we talk about the light in the back. So let's go back over to the setup, walk through a couple of things. So we've talked about the fact that we have this box way back. So you might think, well, wait a minute, we need the white right behind the dragon. Technically, the camera sees this white right behind the dragon when it takes the picture. Remember, the camera's looking in 2D, not in 3D. So all it knows is there's solid white here and there's a dragon here. When that gets printed or displayed on a screen, it looks like this. It can't see that there's this space here. It just knows there's this, and then that. So that's why this can be back here. But another thing to think about in two-dimensional images that you're taking with your camera is that whatever's here looks like it's right in front of whatever's here. So this mouth looks like it's right up against this wing if they're directly in front of each other. They have no depth. The camera can't represent depth in a straight line like that, other than through depth of field, bokeh, going blur. But we've got a good depth of field. We see the whole thing. So what we need to do is we need to get that wing out of the dinosaur's mouth. And you have to kind of play with it. Sometimes you have to kind of squat down and look and see, if I look up through his mouth, do I see anything else in his mouth? I'm going to rotate until I do not, and then go take the shot. With things like this, or even things with a box or like a box or a can, you will have to play with positioning a little bit, because positioning becomes very important when you take any three-dimensional product and collapse it in a two-dimensional image. Let's take another shot. Now you can see in this next shot, even though I checked, the tip of his jaw is touching his wing. Maybe that's fine, maybe it's not. This is all a little bit of personal preference. That's going to bother me though. So I'm going to give him just a little bit more twist and see what I can come up with. Since I've rotated him around, I want to make sure to double check my focus. I do have F11, I have a little bit of forgiveness there, but I still want to make sure that, for instance, his face, since this is a creature, if anything starts to go the slightest bit out of focus, what I don't want it to be is his face. That's looking pretty good. We could continue to play with this, But let's move on to some other challenges, and maybe we'll come back to this little guy. One thing to note, if you're shooting multiple products, if they're a box or a can or something like that, and they're all the exact same size and shape, once you've got everything set up, pretty much put them back in the exact same spot. You can put a dot or a piece of tape or something and drop them in the same place. When you're shooting something like dragons or anything that's got contours and shapes to it, every shot's going to be a little bit different. We might have to play with the reflector a little bit. We're not going to need to play with this light or this light as long as we put this in the same place. That metering will always remain identical. We do not need to touch those. But a reflector or a secondary light or anything like that, you're probably going to have to play with, particularly with things like this where you might get heavy shadows underneath these wings. So first thing, make sure when you swap a product out, regardless of what it is, that you're putting the new product in effectively the same place that the old one was because of the metering of these two lights. So what I'm going to do is hold him here, slide this guy out, and drop this guy down. I'm going to put him at a little bit of an angle, take this one out, and we'll go play with this one. All right, got my gray dinosaur lined up. I guess he's a dragon. Dinosaur, dragon, flying, dinosaur, that thing. Let's take our shot. Again, we're looking pretty good exposure-wise. What you'll notice on this one, though, is we have a lot more shadows underneath him because his wings are blocking a lot of things. As a matter of fact, let's do a little test with this one. I'm going to take that reflector down so that you can see what happens when I get rid of that little bit of bounce light. Okay, I've taken the reflector down. I'm going to reshoot this gray dinosaur. I'm not going to change anything else. So if you look at this shot compared to the previous shot, you can see a lot of shadow along the left edge, where on the previous shot you can see that that's filled in quite a bit. That's what the reflector did. Again, I think we still need to fill in even more, but just that one reflector sitting there made much nicer along that side of his neck. Let's see what else we can do to this one. Okay, I put the primary reflector back in. I can even re-angle that a little bit, try and get a little bit more bounce into him if I want to. Now this could be an assistant. This doesn't have to be a reflector holder. This could be a person standing here holding this reflector for you. It could be you holding it with a remote trigger to your camera as long as you know you're in focus. What I'm going to add now is another little reflector, and I'm going to try to find a way to put this under him. Now what I don't want to do is squish it up against the glass because that could ruin his reflection. And that's one of the things I really want to make sure that I have. So I'm going to try squishing it up under the plexiglass here, but letting it droop down. This isn't even a real reflector. It's a piece of white plastic cardboard, I guess you'd call it. Pretty much anything white. Now, for the primary reflector, I happen to be using the silver side. I just figure these are dragons, a little harsher, probably okay. But underneath, I'm just using white and just see how that works. A lot of this with the reflectors and the fill light is experimentation. There's no way to really know until you try. You can guesstimate, you can look at it and kind of figure it out, but really until you shoot it, you're not going to be 100% positive. Okay, gray dragon, secondary reflector in place. So you can see from the first shot to the third shot, because remember in the middle there we removed the primary reflector. In the first shot we have that side fill from the silver reflector that's up in the holder, but we still have a little bit of shadow kind of under what would be his right shoulder and down his right leg, which is camera left, his right. If we go to the last shot, we can see that's just filled in just a little bit more. Again, it's just a piece of white plastic stuck under there, reflecting a little bit more light up. Now, what we have to be careful of is did it impact his reflection? And you can see it did, because where it lightened things up above it, it also lightened that reflection. So decisions you'll have to make, what you like, what you don't like. We're also seeing a little bit of that, the edge of that, which we can't really tell is the edge of that reflector, but it is cutting through his shadow pretty bad, his reflection pretty bad. So I'm going to make some adjustments and play with this a little bit. Okay, what I've done now, because I can't seem to find an assistant, I've placed the white reflector still underneath, but I've dropped it down onto a crossbar, and I needed it to balance there, so I've set another dragon on it. Again, this is all trial and error. You're just trying to put little pieces of white or silver, something somewhere to bounce light back where you want, and you just keep trying things until you get it right. So we're going to take this shot and see what happens. Okay, I think that did the trick. Again, you play with putting white things where you want light to bounce back, or silver things, and you play with putting black pieces of board or fabric or whatever where you don't want light bouncing from. It's all an experiment, and you use whatever you have on hand. A white piece of foam core from a craft store is just as useful as a white reflector from the photo store. White bounces light. So now here's another interesting one. This guy has holes in his wings. If I were to put him face on, well, technically face left, but rotate him so his body were looking straight forward, I might not see those holes. Because, again, shooting straight on, two-dimensional, can't see into the sides. So I've rotated him such that those holes are presenting themselves to the camera. Maybe not straight on, a little bit off. But so that we can see those. What I want to be careful of, if I look, and I don't know if you can see this, but he has a hand and a tail, and I want to make sure it doesn't look like he's holding his tail. So I want to kind of make sure that his hand and his tail are separated by some distance. And again, you can squat down, take a look. Ultimately, the best way is to take the shot, but you can kind of guesstimate by squatting down and seeing how you're looking. Let's go take this shot. All right, tattered wing dragon, hopefully positioned properly. FYI, I do still have the silver reflector up on the holder and the white reflector down below. I'm going to see, because I'm shooting more solid, darker dragons now that don't have translucent wings. Maybe it'll help to have that down there. Don't know till we try. Let's try. That seems to have worked pretty well, but up under his neck looks a little bit dark to me. So I'm going to adjust that silver reflector, see if I can kick a little more light into him. Again, it's just a reflector. I'm not dealing with other lights on that side, so this should be a pretty easy maneuver. So what I've done here is I've moved the reflector back a little bit, in a little bit, and tilted it up a little bit, and now I'm going to drop it so it's kind of kicking like up more at the dinosaur, sorry, the dragon, the winged dinosaur, however you'd like to refer to him, to try and get up under that neck. Again, this is all kind of trial and error when you're dealing with reflectors, because you're guessing. They're just kind of bouncing like back out, not really focusing it. So tilted the silver reflector. I still have the white one underneath. I don't know if that's really helping as much, but we're going to take the shot and see what happens. Okay, that did open up his neck a little bit. The decision is that enough, or do I want more? Do I want to continue to do it here in camera? Or if I want more, do I want to do it in post? These are all individual decisions. Unless you're shooting this for commercial and you need very specific things, it's all in what you like. We could continue to play with him, but let's move on to another interesting challenge. This guy presents all kinds of unique opportunities, we'll call them. He has a couple different things going on. He has frosted texture translucent. He has truly clear translucent. And he has lots of little details. All of it some level of translucent or transparent. So, let's see what we can do. First of all, we're going to put him back in effectively the same spot. It just so happens that this yellow, clear, frosted guy happens to have a pivotable head. So I've rotated his head to look at me, but his body off axis to try and get some different angles so light's not just pouring through those translucent and transparent wings. See what happens. Oh, I have also removed all the reflectors under and to the side just to see what we get, because I'm not quite sure how the light is going to pass through him. So we're going to start key light, backlight, no reflectors. We actually did pretty well with this shot, as you'll see, but his head is kind of in his hand. Let's play with that. This guy's a little weird. The angle that I put him at, he looks like he's got his claw on the side of his head. So we're going to make some adjustments here. All right, let's see how we did. Yeah, I like that much better. All right, now let's try putting a couple of these guys on here. I don't think we're going to put this guy in the group because he doesn't really match the aesthetic of the others, but let's try shooting 2 or 3 of them together, see what challenges we run into. Okay, so I've set up a little scene, but I've tried to keep in mind how all of these little guys interact with the lighting. First of all, I've got one facing kind of that way, so his neck will get filled by the reflector. I've got another kind of facing this way, so he'll get filled in a little bit. I'll have to be careful that he doesn't get a little too much light because he's so close over here. And I've got the center guy who's a little more straight on, kind of tucked in. To do that, I've actually intertwined 2 of their tails. It was the only way to get them this close. But I'm trying to think how each of them needs the light in order to expose best. So now that I've played with that, again, we take our test shot and see where we are. I'm reasonably happy with this, but I think I'm going to move them closer to the reflector side because I want a little more fill on that really dark one to camera left. So here we go. So I think we did okay there. Now again, this was a lot of trial and error, but I want you to notice the trial and error was with the individual products and trying to get light up under them and around them and on them, not with that blown out background. Once we set that blown out background and once we set that key light, we haven't messed with those. We haven't messed with the exposure on the camera. We haven't messed with adjusting the exposure on the strobes. We haven't messed with moving the strobe in the back or the strobe off to the side. The only thing we've done is move reflectors to try and deal with shadows where they fall. Once this is set up, that primary exposure is good to go. We don't need to mess with it. And I think that's the important part to remember. If you get your metering correct in the beginning and you set that backdrop far enough back that it's not affecting your exposure up in the image, you're good. You're ready to go. Just be ready to play with your shadows. Have a few reflectors around. White pieces of foam core, white pieces of paper, white pieces of cardboard, white reflectors, anything that can be held, and something to hold it, be that a stand or another human, or you with a remote trigger. The exposure of the shot is the exposure of the shot. So the white background, although it seems a little bit intimidating, once you figure out that it's just getting that light in the back correct, and then letting it go and moving on to deal with shadows, it becomes 1,000 times simpler. So let's review. First, went to the camera, set the exposure that I wanted for all of these shots. That happened to be ISO 100, so I'd have a nice low ISO, 1/200th of a second, and f11, so I'd have sufficient depth of field. Then, without the flash trigger, I took one shot to get my blank frame. I needed to make sure none of the ambient light was going to impact my exposure. Then I went over and dealt with the lights. Let's go review that. First thing we did, set our product where we want it on our plexiglass because we want reflection. Set our key light. Key light set the meter to 1/200th of a second, ISO 100, flash, get to the point where I'm f11 on the light. That matches my camera, good exposure on the product. Now, set my backlight. Move it back, create some space, meter it at the light, ISO 100, 1/200th of a second, f16, effectively one stop brighter than my key light. Next thing, play with where I'm going to need a reflector. In this case, sometimes I needed one, sometimes I needed two. If these had all been identically shaped products and they had all had the same reflective properties and texture and contours, I could have set that and let it fly. Because each of these things were unique, I was moving those reflectors around. The key being that I was not moving lights around and I was not remetering every time I changed a product. I was just moving a reflector around. That made it much simpler. So, set your exposure on the camera, get your black frame, set up your key light, set up your backlight, set up your reflector, take your test shots, and you're off to the races. All right, I hope this helped. See you next time.